Daniel chapter 8. We'll begin reading in verse 1. In the third year of the reign of King Belshazzar, a vision appeared to me, Daniel, after that which appeared to me at the first. And I saw in the vision, and when I saw, I was in Susa, the citadel, which is in the province of Elam. And might get into that next week. I don't know. There's actually some important details that I just didn't have time to get into tonight. But we'll see. And I saw in the vision, and I was at the Ulai Canal. I raised my eyes and saw, and behold, a ram standing on the bank of the canal. It had two horns, and both horns were high, but one was higher than the other, and the higher one came up last. I saw the ram charging westward and northward and southward. No beast could stand before him, and there was no one who could rescue from his power. He did as he pleased and became great. Now let me just pause there. You notice now this happened earlier, because right there back in verse 1 it says this Daniel received the vision in the third year of King Belshazzar's reign. But if you remember our study in chapter 6, which would have been 6 weeks ago, maybe 2 months, that was the story of the handwriting on the wall and the great feast that Belshazzar held, and how he'd been killed. The Medes and the Persians had taken over the city of Babylon, and he had been killed. So Daniel's referring back to something that he had seen previous to this being written. And so now let's go to verse 15, and we'll talk a little bit about, and then we'll talk about some of the things he saw. Verse 15, and when I, Daniel, had seen the vision, I sought to understand it. And behold, there stood before me one having the appearance of a man, and I heard a man's voice between the banks of the Ulai, and it called Gabriel, that's of course the angel, make this man understand the vision. So he came near where I stood, and when he came, I was frightened and fell on my face. But he said to me, understand, O son of man, that the vision is for the time of the end. And when he had spoken to me, I fell into a deep sleep with my face to the ground. But he touched me and made me stand up. He said, behold, I will make known to you what will be at the latter end of the indignation, for it refers to the appointed time of the end. As for the ram that you saw with the two horns, these are the kings of Media and Persia. Now, we're not going to cover everything tonight because I simply don't have time. And like I said, we'll try to come back next week and fill in more details. But it says very clearly here, the two-horned ram, verse 20, which goes back to verse 3, where the vision, that part of the vision begins, is the Medo-Persian Empire. That was a partnership between the kingdom of the Medes, or Media was what they were called, and the Persians. And the second horn that's on this ram, there's two horns, the Medes and the Persians. The second horn is the taller one, and that represents Persia, because it wasn't an equal partnership. Persia was stronger. And this ties into the bear, which we saw in our last study in chapter 7. So you've got two nations that are working together. They essentially become one empire, but the Persians were the stronger side. And as Daniel makes clear, they formed a powerful force. Again, verse 4, I saw the ram charging westward and northward and southward. No beast could stand before him, and there was no one who could rescue from his power. He did as he pleased and became great. Now understand, Daniel's seeing this vision before the Medes and the Persians have taken over Babylon. So this is something that God is showing him before it happens. And this ram heads in these directions, and then history bears this out. He talks about the beast charging westward, and that refers to from where they were centered. They took over Babylonia and Syria and large parts of Asia Minor. And then to the north, they conquered what we now call Armenia and parts of the world that surrounded the Caspian Sea, which is kind of in what used to call the Soviet Union, right? The southwestern edge. And then to the south, they went into North Africa and conquered several nations there. And so Daniel's seeing this all before it happens. This isn't him looking back later and filling in like, oh yeah, that's what I saw. I'm going to make it sound like a prophecy. He's given this vision while Babylon is still his home, and Belshazzar is king of Babylon. And so I was thinking about this, right? Daniel's seeing all this happening. He's seeing the Medes and the Persians. And I got thinking about the story of the writing on the wall. You remember that? We spent a lot of time on it. Belshazzar, he's got all these nobles, and they're getting drunk, having this party. The Medes and the Persians are outside the city walls, laying siege. But Babylon's got food and supplies and a water supply and weaponry laid up. They are safe and secure, humanly speaking, right? And then suddenly this hand appears in the midst of this big drunken feast, and you remember that story. And Belshazzar the Bible says he's knocking at the knees. That's how terrified he is. And he calls for the wise men of Babylon to interpret. None of them can, the magicians. Nobody has any idea what's going on here. And finally, the queen mother convinces Belshazzar, call this man Daniel, this Jewish man. He helped your grandfather. He was able to interpret. And so Belshazzar finally calls him in. But I don't know how many of you remember this. He treats Daniel in a very disrespectful way. It's not really evident in English, but I spent a lot of time, I think I did, kind of going through some of the stuff in the ancient culture, the way Belshazzar phrased stuff. He was speaking to Daniel again in a very dismissive way, like, well, I've heard you can do this, and I'll give you a chance. That's kind of how it comes out in the original. And so Daniel's his last resort. He doesn't really want to ask Daniel, but he doesn't have anybody else that can help him. And then he tries to bribe him. And that's in verse 16, all the way back in chapter 5. Belshazzar says this, I have heard that you can give interpretations and solve problems. Now, if you can read the writing and make known to me its interpretation, you shall be clothed with purple and have a chain of gold around your neck and shall be third ruler in the kingdom. And I spent time talking about who the second ruler was, Nabonidus, his father. And you notice how Daniel responds. Remember, he's talking to Belshazzar, the second most powerful man in the world, humanly speaking. Daniel answered and said before the king, let your gifts be for yourself and give your rewards to another. In other words, I don't want your stuff. I don't want all these things you're offering. Nevertheless, I will read the writing to the king and make it known to him the interpretation. In other words, Daniel was making it clear. He was choosing to read these words and interpret them. He didn't really feel this pressure. And he wasn't interested in any of the promises the king made. Oh, you'll be third in the kingdom, or these rewards, I'll give you all these gifts, the purple and the chain of gold. And part of it obviously was because Daniel's faith was in God. Obviously, right? He didn't need to be afraid of what a man could do to him. But I wonder if part of Daniel's attitude had to do with the fact that he knew he was talking to a man who was already dead but didn't know it. Remember, Daniel has seen this vision that he describes in chapter 8. Daniel knows Belshazzar's days are numbered and the Medes and the Persians are going to be taking over Babylon. And here's Belshazzar, if you interpret this, I'll make you third in the kingdom. Yeah, what kingdom? It's not going to be around. I'll do this. Who are you? You're dead. You just don't know it. And he did die that night. And so Daniel's knowledge of what's going to happen is kind of one of these themes that you see coming through again and again throughout this book. Not just in his visions of the future, but everything we've been studying, all the way through chapter 6 as well, the story of his life. No matter how strong any king appeared, Nebuchadnezzar in the heyday of his reign, right? No matter how powerful any kingdom might have seemed, we see coming through this theme again and again, God is the one who rules the nations. God is the one who decides how long any king or ruler is going to exercise power. You remember chapter 20, verses 20 and 21. Blessed be the name of God forever and ever, to whom belong wisdom and might. Verse 21, he changes times and seasons. And then the phrase, he removes kings and sets up kings. Probably most of you are like me in the sense that when I'm stuck in a situation I don't want, I get discouraged. Really? I'm the only one, right? When you read Daniel's story, which we've been doing I think we're in part 34. We've been in this a long time. That just isn't one of his problems. He doesn't get discouraged, doesn't get beaten down, doesn't get like, oh, poor me. And that's, I think, so much part of it was the fact that even though he didn't know everything about the future, the one thing he was convinced of was that God is in charge of tomorrow. He knew that. So even here you've got Belshazzar promising Daniel this or that, and Daniel's like, I don't. You're not going to be here tomorrow. And he knew the Medes and the Persians are on their way, just a matter of time, very short period, and they're going to overcome Babylon. But it wasn't just that he knew the Medes and the Persians are coming. God had even shown him after the Medes and the Persians, and their kingdom would last for about, as I recall, 200 years. I could be wrong, but I think it was. Then the Greeks would come. Let's go to chapter 8, verse 5. As I was considering, so here's the second image in the vision. Behold, a male goat came from the west across the face of the whole earth. And now, Greece is to the west of the Medo-Persian power center. He came across the face of the whole earth without touching the ground. And that's an image of not so much flying, but great speed. Just rapid movement. And the goat had a conspicuous horn between his eyes. He came to the ram with the two horns, which is what we've already seen, Medo-Persia, right? Which I had seen standing on the bank of the canal. And he ran at him with in his powerful wrath. I saw him come close to the ram, and he was enraged against him and struck the ram and broke his two horns. And the ram had no power to stand before him, but he cast him down to the ground and trampled on him. And there was no one who could rescue the ram from his power. Then the goat became exceedingly great, but when he was strong, the great horn was broken, and instead of it, there came up 4 conspicuous horns towards the 4 winds of the earth. And then verse 20, here's the interpretation. As for the ram you saw with these 2 horns, these are the kings of Media and Persia. We already read that, but look at verse 21. And the goat is the king of Greece, and the great horn between his eyes is the first king. So, obviously, this goat with the one horn that defeats the Medes and the Persians, that goat represents Alexander the Great. We've all heard of him. He's the first great military general from Greece. He takes over from his father, Philip of Macedon, and he unites the Greeks in this warfare. And the speed at which he waged war was incredible. So he's 21 years old when he becomes general of his father's army. And by the time he's 26, he's pretty much conquered most of the known world, the Mediterranean basin, including many parts of North Africa, and he's firmly in control. And but his kingdom is short-lived because he dies at age 33. And he doesn't have any children. And so his kingdom is divided among his 4 generals. And these are all ambitious and powerful men. You can read about him in history. They were well known. But none of them had his ability, the same ability he had as a general or to lead soldiers. That's in verse 22. Again, as for the horn that was broken, in place of which 4 others arose, 4 kingdoms shall arise from his nation, but not with his power. And that's how it worked out. Alexander's generals were powerful, but not like he was. And so again, this is all being foretold hundreds of years before it happens. Here's the point. Kings and nations may seem powerful, and we easily get overwhelmed by what they seem to do, and especially when we're in a time like we are now where the headlines are getting ominous and this is happening and that is happening and what's going to be going on tomorrow. But the whole point of Daniel is that there is no king, there is no kingdom, that God isn't aware of them well in advance. And this sounds crazy, but listen, there is no king or kingdom for which God does not have a purpose, even those that are evil. This sounds controversial, but listen to me. And I have to be careful saying this, because I'm not endorsing anything that happened. But God has had a purpose for every evil. Nazi Germany, as vile and terrible as they were, God was using them. How can that be? Because he's God. The Soviet Union, the United States. We have our own evil. All of the nations of the world that have seemed indomitable and depending who you're asking, oh, they're the worst people in the world. They've been part of God's plan. Now, you may not see it. I may not see it in the moment. But God has always had a use for every nation. And that's still true today. Now, and that here's how this here's one of the ways this ought to affect us. You don't have to agree with the results of the most recent election or the election before that or the election before that. You don't have to be happy about what the Supreme Court has done or this court or that court. God is in control. Even when what we see happening in our own nation is clearly evil, listen, God has a reason for allowing it to take place. I may not like it. I may not want it to happen. I may not understand why God is allowing it, but God is in control. Daniel 2:20 and 21. He raises up kings and he deposes them. And that's something I need to remember. Just because I don't agree with something that's happening, or just because I don't understand it, that in no way means that God isn't at work. It just means that my perspective is limited. And I need to be reminded from time to time, as do we all, God always knows exactly what he's doing. Doesn't matter who's in the White House. Doesn't matter who's in the Supreme Court. Doesn't matter who's in the governor's mansion. Doesn't matter who's pastor of Faith Assembly of God. All the way down to God knows what he's doing. And you may not have the greatest leaders over you, but God is still God. Your boss may be the worst person in the world. Nobody say amen. But God is still God, right? God still knows what he's doing. And so here's how I want to end this. And I've been thinking about this for a couple days. It's really interesting. That ought to affect how I worship. And we're going to go to Psalm 137 here. And this is something that happens when the Israelites are talking about early in their time of captivity in Babylon. You remember the story. They've been in sin, and God is judging them, and the Babylonians invade, and they're essentially, the majority of the Jews are force-marched across hundreds of miles of desert terrain, and now they're in Babylon where they're trapped and stuck, and they're not going home anytime soon. And what had happened? Well, a lot of things, but here's one thing. Psalm 137 talks about this, beginning at verse 1. By the waters or the rivers of Babylon, there we sat down and wept when we remembered Zion. Zion is representative of Jerusalem and Israel, their homeland and the place of God's presence. So they're thinking about home, and they're in Babylon, and they're weeping. And so verse 2, on the willows, these trees, there we hung up our lyres, or that word can mean harp. It's a kind of a fluid word in Hebrew, a musical instrument. For there our captors required of us songs, and our tormentors mirth. In other words, sing us a song, tell us some funny stories of your homeland, saying, sing us one of the songs of Zion. And then they ask the question, how shall we sing the Lord's song in a foreign land? So you think about that. This is happening very early in Israel's captivity in Babylon. And the Babylonians are trying to get to know these people. The Jews weren't the only ones they took and made them captive in Babylon. There were dozens of other nations that they had brought in, and the Babylonians wanted to get to know them. What are you about? What drives you? What kind of people are you? So sing us some of your songs. Tell us some of your stories. But the people, the Jewish people, are feeling so depressed here very clearly. They don't want to sing. They're hanging up their harps, their lyres on these nearby trees. Who wants to sing when you've been ripped out of your homeland and you're stuck in a foreign nation? And part of the problem, and I understand why they felt this way, but part of the problem was they had the wrong perspective. They were kind of like, oh, poor us, and I'm not condemning them because I do plenty of that, right? But they're, oh, poor us. And what they had forgotten was that the reason they were in Babylon in the first place was because they had failed to trust God. They had drifted away from God over the years and had begun serving false gods and idols. And this time of captivity in Babylon wasn't going to come to an end until they had finally relearned the lesson of trusting in God. So they had tried to live their own way without God, had followed false idols, and now God is drawing them back to him through this terrible experience. And if they had been living for God, and this is the key, if they had been living for God, they would have been able to sing his praises. Why? Listen, and I'm not condemning anybody because this is my problem too. But it's still true, even though I'm not very good at this. The worship of God does not depend on your circumstances. He's worthy of being worshiped no matter what situation you are in. So let's go back to verse 4 of Psalm 137. Here's what they're saying. How shall we sing the Lord's song in a foreign land? But that's kind of the point. No matter where I am, no matter how things appear, God is worthy of worship because he knows what he's doing. And so I can get depressed when I see what's happening in our nation and happening around the world, and wars of rumors of wars, which we're getting caught up into again. And they all know the Middle East, God is still worthy of worship, no matter what. So here you've got these messages that God's given Daniel. These weren't guesses about what could happen. These weren't geopolitical experts, debating. This was God saying, here's how it's going to work out. This nation's going to rise, and then they're going to fall. And this nation's going to rise, and then they're going to fall. And God had a plan for each and every one of them. Why? Because he removes kings and sets up kings. And the same is true for the events in your life. God works everything out, and he uses everything that happens to you. Listen, both the good and the bad. Let me say that again, because I got to hear it. He uses the good and the bad for his purposes. God's determined that. But here's what he doesn't determine. He doesn't determine our reaction. You can respond in unbelief, bitterness, whatever, or you can respond in faith. God's still going to use the circumstances, but he doesn't make you respond in one particular way. That's up to you. That's up to me. And so that's what I want to encourage you to do as we conclude. When you look at what's happening around you, let's say worldwide or in our nation or in our state or in our community, and when you look at what's happening to you in your individual circumstances, even if you cannot see God's hand, the one thing you can do is ask him to help you to believe that he's working for your good. Even if you can't see it, you can still pray and say, Lord, help me to believe it. And that's not true because I say so. It's true because God says so. Let me leave you with Psalm 23, verses 20. No, not 23. I've written that wrong. I think it's 123, verses 23 and 24. The steps of a man are established by the Lord when he delights in his way. In other words, that's an image of worship, right? And when you're delighting in the Lord, verse 24, though he fall, that's us, he shall not be cast headlong, for the Lord upholds his hand. So, one of the things I really have been enjoying with our study of Daniel is remembering this is not a doom and gloom book. And I feel bad that so many preachers, unfortunately, have turned it into that. The end is coming, get ready, run for the hills, and hide in a cave. It's not what it's about. It's a message that God's in control. And yes, things might get hard for those who follow the Lord. But God knows what he's doing. God is faithful. And if we stay faithful to him, we will be kept in the palm of his hand. And again, I keep repeating it, but let me say it one last time, then it's your turn to talk. God knows what he is doing. Amen.